Why would you bring her? The whisper wasn't quiet enough. It floated across the polished conference table like a paper airplane nobody meant to throw, but everyone noticed. Someone chuckled softly. Another voice added, barely hiding the amusement. She's his secretary, the one with the glasses. Ethan Carter didn't look up from the documents in front of him, but he heard every word. At 34, Ethan was the youngest CEO in the room and the man responsible for turning Carter Dynamics into one of the fastest-growing tech logistics companies in the country. The boardroom overlooking downtown Chicago was filled with investors in tailored suits, people who measured success in stock charts and quarterly projections. They were discussing a dinner scheduled for that evening, a delicate meeting with two potential partners from San Francisco who were deciding whether to invest $40 million into Ethan's newest expansion project. Everything had to be perfect. One of the senior managers leaned back in his chair and said casually, "You should bring Victoria tonight. Investors love familiar faces." Victoria Blake, the daughter of a major shareholder. Elegant, polished, and very interested in becoming Mrs. Carter. Ethan closed the folder slowly and finally looked up. His gray eyes moved across the table, calm but unreadable. "Victoria won't be joining us tonight," he said. A faint ripple of surprise crossed the room. "Then who's your plus one?" another executive asked. Ethan's gaze shifted toward the glass wall of the office. Through it, the outer workspace was visible, rows of desks, computer screens glowing softly under the late afternoon lights. And there she was. Emily Harper sat at her small desk near the corner, typing quietly, unaware that the entire boardroom had suddenly gone silent. She wore the same oversized cardigan she always wore, her brown hair tied back in a simple knot, a pair of rectangular glasses sliding slightly down her nose as she worked. She looked like someone people passed in the hallway without noticing, someone easy to underestimate. Ethan closed his pen and said evenly, "Emily is coming with me." The room went still. Someone blinked. Another person laughed awkwardly, assuming he was joking. "Your secretary?" a voice said. "Yes," Ethan replied, already gathering his papers. The meeting ended a few minutes later, but the whispers started immediately. Outside the boardroom, Emily had no idea what had just happened. She was finishing a scheduling email when Ethan's office door opened and he stepped out. His presence alone changed the energy of the floor. Conversations softened, keyboards paused. Emily quickly stood up. "Mr. Carter, do you need?" Ethan stopped beside her desk. For a brief moment, he studied her like he was noticing something most people had overlooked. Then he said the words that would change the course of her evening, and perhaps her life. "Emily," he said calmly, "clear your schedule tonight. You're having dinner with me." Emily blinked, certain she had heard him incorrectly. Around her, several coworkers had already turned their heads, their expressions hovering somewhere between curiosity and disbelief. "Dinner," she repeated quietly, adjusting her glasses as if the movement might help her understand what he meant. Ethan Carter did not repeat himself often, and he did not look like a man who joked about his schedule. "Yes," he said simply. "Tonight at 7. A business dinner. I need someone I can trust to be there." Emily felt her stomach tighten slightly. Trust was not the word most people in the office used when they talked about her. Usually the comments were softer but sharper, little jokes about her quiet personality, her oversized sweaters, the way she always kept her head down and worked while everyone else socialized. She glanced around the office floor and noticed the whispers starting already. Two assistants near the copy machine exchanged a look. Someone leaned closer to another desk and murmured something that made both of them smile. Emily lowered her voice. "Mr. Carter, are you sure you mean me?" Ethan studied her expression for a moment. He had spent the past 2 years watching Emily Harper manage schedules, organize contracts, and quietly fix problems before anyone else noticed them. She never raised her voice, never tried to impress anyone, and never asked for recognition. In a company filled with people who talked too much, she was the only one who actually listened. "I do mean you," he said. "This dinner involves investors. I need someone who pays attention." Emily hesitated, fingers lightly gripping the edge of her desk. "I do not think I am the right person for something like that." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "Why not?" She almost laughed at the question, although the sound never fully came out. "Because people expect someone different." Her eyes flickered toward the reflective surface of her computer screen where her own image stared back at her. Simple cardigan, plain hair, glasses that had slipped down her nose again. Someone more presentable. Ethan followed her glance, and for a moment seemed to consider her reflection as carefully as he had the spreadsheets she handled every morning. Then he said something that made Emily pause. Presentable is not the same thing as capable. The office had grown unusually quiet. It was the kind of silence that spreads when people pretend to work but are actually listening. Ethan checked the time on his watch. Be ready by 6:30, he said calmly. I will send a car. Emily stared after him as he walked away toward his office, his footsteps steady across the polished floor. The moment his door closed, the whispers began in earnest. One coworker leaned over her cubicle wall and said with a teasing smile, Emily, you have a dinner date with the boss? Another voice added, better find something nicer than that sweater. Emily forced a polite smile and sat back down, but her heart was beating faster than it had all day. She opened her calendar to clear the evening, still unsure whether the entire situation was a mistake. Across the office, inside the glass corner office, Ethan Carter looked down at the city traffic moving slowly along Michigan Avenue, 20 stories below. Investors would be watching him tonight. Competitors would be listening to every word. But for reasons he could not fully explain yet, he felt oddly certain that bringing Emily Harper was the smartest decision he had made all week. At 5:45 that evening, Emily Harper was still sitting at her desk staring at her computer screen, even though she had not typed a single word for the past 10 minutes. The office floor had slowly emptied as employees left for the day, but a few people remained, clearly lingering longer than necessary just to watch what would happen next. The whispers from earlier had not completely disappeared. In fact, they had grown louder. Someone passing by had said with a half smile, "Big night tonight, Emily." Another voice had added, "Do not forget, investors expect elegance." Emily pretended not to hear any of it. Instead, she opened her desk drawer and pulled out the small compact mirror she rarely used. The reflection looking back at her seemed exactly the same as it always had. Brown hair pulled into a tight knot, light freckles across her nose, glasses that made her look more serious than she felt. There was nothing about her appearance that belonged in the elegant restaurants where executives negotiated million-dollar deals. For a moment, she considered walking to Ethan Carter's office and telling him there had been a misunderstanding. But the memory of his calm confidence stopped her. Presentable is not the same thing as capable. She repeated the sentence quietly in her mind. At 6:15, her phone vibrated softly on the desk. A short message appeared from the building reception desk downstairs. Your car has arrived. Emily took a slow breath and stood up. Her coworkers noticed immediately. A few heads turned as she walked toward the elevator carrying her simple shoulder bag. The cardigan she wore suddenly felt heavier than usual. When the elevator doors opened in the lobby, the evening sunlight filtered through the glass entrance and illuminated a sleek black sedan waiting outside. The driver stepped forward politely and opened the rear door. Miss Harper, he asked. Emily nodded, feeling slightly out of place even hearing her name spoken in that tone. As the car began moving through the busy Chicago streets, she watched the skyline glide past the window. Tall buildings reflected the orange glow of the sunset, while the traffic crawled slowly along Lakeshore Drive. The city looked different from the back seat of a luxury car. It felt quieter, almost distant. 20 minutes later, the sedan stopped in front of a small boutique clothing store tucked between two high-end restaurants on Michigan Avenue. Emily frowned slightly, assuming the driver had misunderstood the destination. I think there is a mistake, she said gently. But the driver smiled. No mistake, Miss Harper. Mr. Carter asked me to bring you here first. Before she could respond, the glass door of the boutique opened, and a woman in her 40s stepped outside with an enthusiastic smile. You must be Emily, the woman said warmly. I am Natalie. Mr. Carter called ahead. Emily hesitated. Called ahead for what? Natalie laughed softly and gestured toward the elegant dresses displayed behind her inside the softly lit store. For your evening transformation. Emily felt her cheeks warm instantly. I think there has been a misunderstanding, she said quickly. I do not need anything fancy. I am only attending a dinner. Natalie's smile softened but did not fade. My dear, she said gently, this dinner involves the most powerful investors in the city. And according to Mr. Carter, you deserve to walk into that room with confidence. Emily stood frozen for a moment on the sidewalk as the city lights slowly flickered on around her. For the first time that day, she began to realize something unexpected. Tonight was not just another work assignment. Something about this evening was about to change everything. Emily stood just inside the boutique doorway while the sounds of evening traffic drifted faintly through the glass behind her. The store itself felt like a completely different world from the office she had left less than an hour earlier. Soft golden lights glowed from elegant fixtures in the ceiling, reflecting gently off polished mirrors and neatly arranged displays of dresses that looked as if they belonged on red carpets instead of quiet Chicago streets. For a moment, she simply remained still, unsure whether she should even step farther inside. Natalie noticed the hesitation immediately and smiled in a reassuring way that felt sincere rather than sales-driven. "You look like someone who believes she walked into the wrong place," Natalie said kindly. Emily let out a small nervous laugh. "That is exactly what I am thinking." Natalie gestured toward a comfortable chair near a large mirror. "Then let me explain something first. Mr. Carter called me this afternoon and said only one thing before he hung up. He said that tonight you are attending a dinner where people will judge you before you even sit down. And he said he wanted you to walk into that room knowing they were wrong." Emily felt a quiet warmth rise to her cheeks. No one had ever described her role in such a dramatic way before. Most days she felt invisible at the office, the person who organized everyone else's success without ever being noticed. Natalie gently guided her toward the chair and began studying her reflection in the mirror with thoughtful attention. "You have something many people in this city try very hard to create but never achieve," Natalie said calmly. Emily raised an eyebrow. "What is that?" Natalie smiled. "Natural presence." Emily almost laughed again, but stopped when Natalie carefully removed the elastic band holding her hair in place. Brown strands fell softly around her shoulders for the first time that day. Natalie tilted her head slightly, as if examining a painting that had been hidden beneath a frame. "Now we are getting somewhere," she said quietly. The transformation began slowly, almost like a quiet experiment. Natalie selected a simple evening dress from a rack near the back of the store. It was not overly dramatic, just a deep midnight blue that seemed to reflect the evening sky outside. "Try this," she said. Emily disappeared into the dressing room, still unsure whether any of this was necessary. When she stepped out a few minutes later, Natalie's expression softened with quiet satisfaction. The dress fit perfectly, elegant without trying too hard. Next came subtle makeup that highlighted Emily's eyes rather than hiding her freckles. Finally, Natalie reached toward the glasses resting on Emily's nose. "Do you wear contact lenses?" she asked gently. Emily nodded. "Sometimes. I just do not usually bother at work." Natalie handed her a small case. "Tonight might be one of those times." A few minutes later, Emily looked back into the mirror again. The woman staring back at her felt unfamiliar, yet strangely recognizable at the same time. It was still her face, still the same quiet expression, but the details people usually overlooked had suddenly come into focus. Natalie stepped back with folded arms and smiled. "Well," she said softly, "if Mr. Carter expected a transformation, I believe he is about to be very surprised." When Emily finally stepped out of the boutique, the evening air of Chicago felt cooler against her skin than it had earlier. The city lights along Michigan Avenue had fully awakened now, glowing across storefront windows and reflecting softly on the pavement. For a brief moment, she paused near the glass door, almost uncertain whether she should continue walking toward the black sedan waiting at the curb. The driver noticed her immediately and stepped forward to open the door, but his polite expression shifted slightly the moment he saw her. For a second, he looked as though he was trying to recognize someone familiar in a completely unexpected way. "Good evening, Miss Harper," he said respectfully, though the tone in his voice carried a hint of surprise. Emily nodded politely, still adjusting to the unfamiliar feeling of the dress moving lightly as she stepped into the car. During the short drive through downtown Chicago, she watched the city through the tinted window, noticing details she had never really paid attention to before. The warm glow from restaurant patios, the steady movement of taxis and pedestrians, the quiet confidence of people walking into elegant buildings as if they belonged there. In less than 10 minutes, the car slowed to a stop in front of one of the most well-known restaurants in the city, a place where business deals and quiet celebrations often happened behind tall glass doors and soft golden lighting. Emily felt her heart begin to beat faster the moment she saw Ethan Carter standing near the entrance. He was speaking with the restaurant host while checking something on his phone, his posture calm and composed the way it always was during important meetings. The driver stepped out first and opened Emily's door. The sound of the city seemed to fade slightly as she stepped onto the sidewalk. Ethan looked up at that exact moment. For a brief second, he did not move. The calm expression he usually carried shifted into something almost impossible to describe. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe something closer to disbelief. His eyes remained on Emily as she slowly approached the entrance. The woman walking toward him looked nothing like the quiet secretary who had been sitting behind a desk that afternoon. The simple blue dress moved gracefully with each step. Her hair rested softly around her shoulders instead of being tied back. Without her glasses, her eyes seemed brighter, more confident, almost curious about the world around her. For the first time since he had met her, Ethan Carter seemed completely caught off guard. Emily stopped a few feet in front of him, suddenly aware that he had not spoken yet. "Mr. Carter," she said gently, unsure whether she should feel embarrassed by the attention from the people passing nearby. Ethan blinked once, as if returning to the present moment. Then he allowed a quiet breath to escape and shook his head slightly with a faint smile that rarely appeared in business meetings. "Emily," he said slowly, his voice softer than usual, "I think the investors tonight are going to remember this dinner for a very long time." Emily glanced down briefly, unsure how to respond to the unexpected compliment. "I hope I will not make a mistake," she said honestly. Ethan offered his arm in a simple gesture before guiding her toward the entrance. "Something tells me," he replied calmly, "you are about to do the exact opposite." And as the restaurant doors opened and warm lights spilled across the marble floor inside, neither of them realized just how right that feeling would be. The moment Ethan and Emily stepped into the restaurant, the quiet elegance of the room seemed to pause for half a heartbeat. Soft jazz music drifted from hidden speakers, and the gentle clink of silverware against porcelain filled the warm golden space. Conversations continued, but several heads turned almost immediately. It was not unusual for people to notice Ethan Carter when he entered a room. As the young chief executive of one of Chicago's fastest-growing technology firms, he had become a familiar figure in business circles. But tonight the attention was different. Tonight people were looking at the woman beside him. Emily felt it instantly, the subtle shift in the room, the brief silence that often followed curiosity. She kept her posture calm as Ethan guided her toward a private dining section near the back where a long polished table had already been prepared. 3 men and 1 woman were seated there, each dressed in the understated elegance of people accustomed to making large financial decisions over quiet dinners. One of them, a silver-haired man in his early 60s, stood as Ethan approached. "Ethan," he said with a warm handshake. "Good to see you again." Ethan returned the greeting smoothly before gesturing toward Emily. "This is Emily Harper," he said. "She works closely with me at Carter Dynamics." Emily offered a polite smile and shook hands with each person at the table. "It is very nice to meet you," she said calmly. The investors exchanged brief glances that Emily noticed but pretended not to see. They had clearly expected someone else. Perhaps a socialite. Perhaps Victoria Blake. Instead, they found themselves meeting a woman who only a few hours earlier had been quietly answering emails behind a desk. They sat down, and the conversation began with the usual pleasantries about travel and business markets. At first, Emily simply listened while Ethan discussed expansion strategies and logistics platforms with the confidence of someone who understood every number he presented. But as the discussion moved deeper into supply chain planning, one of the investors leaned forward thoughtfully. "Ethan," the man said, "your proposal depends heavily on reducing shipping delays across 3 major distribution hubs. That sounds impressive in theory, but coordinating that kind of efficiency across the Midwest is not simple." Ethan nodded slightly, acknowledging the concern. Before he could respond, Emily spoke quietly. "Actually, the coordination challenge becomes easier if you restructure the hub rotation schedule." The table fell silent for a moment. Emily immediately felt the weight of their attention and wondered if she had overstepped. But the investor simply raised an eyebrow with interest. "How would you restructure it?" he asked. Emily folded her hands gently on the table, her voice calm but clear. "Right now the hubs operate independently. If they were connected through a shared forecasting system, Delays in one city could automatically shift shipping priority to the next location. It reduces idle freight time by almost 12%. Ethan turned slightly toward her, clearly surprised by the precise number. One of the investors leaned back with a thoughtful smile. "That is a very specific improvement," he said. "How did you calculate it?" Emily hesitated for a brief moment before answering honestly. "I ran the numbers last month while organizing the expansion reports." For the first time that evening, a quiet ripple of impressed laughter moved around the table. And across from her, Ethan Carter realized something unexpected. The investors were no longer looking at Emily as his quiet secretary. They were looking at her as the smartest person in the room. For several seconds after Emily finished speaking, the quiet restaurant table held a kind of thoughtful silence that only appeared when something unexpected had just happened. The silver-haired investor who had asked the question leaned back slowly in his chair, studying her with new curiosity. Across from him, another investor exchanged a quick glance with his colleague before nodding slightly, as if acknowledging that her answer had changed the direction of the conversation. Emily immediately felt a hint of embarrassment rise to her cheeks. She had not meant to interrupt Ethan's presentation. She had simply spoken the same way she often did when organizing the reports late at night in the office, quietly solving problems that no one else had time to notice. Ethan watched her for a moment before speaking again. His tone was calm, but there was a new respect in his voice that had not been there earlier. "Emily reviews most of our operational data," he explained to the table. "If there is a weakness in our system, she usually sees it before I do." The investors responded with soft chuckles of approval. The silver-haired man lifted his glass slightly. "Then I believe we should listen carefully whenever she decides to speak." The tension that often surrounded serious financial discussions seemed to dissolve a little after that. Dinner was served, and the conversation flowed more naturally between topics of technology, logistics, and the changing economy. To Emily's surprise, the investors began directing more questions toward her. One asked about distribution forecasting. Another wanted her opinion on warehouse automation. Each time, she answered carefully, explaining the details as clearly as she could without sounding overly confident. And each time the reaction was the same quiet nod of approval. Ethan noticed something else happening as the evening continued. The same people who had glanced at Emily with polite uncertainty when she first arrived were now leaning slightly forward when she spoke, genuinely interested in what she had to say. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. At one point, the woman investor at the table smiled warmly and said, "Emily, I must admit something. When Ethan introduced you earlier, I assumed you were here simply as company for the evening." Emily lowered her eyes slightly with a shy smile. "That is what I assumed too," she admitted honestly. The table laughed softly at her humility, but Ethan did not laugh. Instead, he watched her carefully, noticing something he had never truly paid attention to before. It was not just her intelligence. It was the quiet confidence that appeared whenever she talked about solving problems. The way her voice stayed calm, even when explaining complicated ideas. The way she listened carefully before answering instead of trying to impress anyone. For the first time since he had hired her 2 years earlier, Ethan Carter realized he might have underestimated the most reliable person in his entire company. As dessert plates were placed on the table, the silver-haired investor finally leaned forward again with a satisfied expression. "Ethan," he said thoughtfully, "when we first scheduled this dinner, we expected a strong business presentation. Instead, we discovered something even more interesting." Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. "What is that?" The investor smiled and gestured lightly toward Emily. "You seem to have built a company where even the quietest voice in the room can change the future of the business." And although the words were directed toward Ethan, the admiration in the man's voice made it clear who had truly impressed everyone that night. As the evening continued, the energy around the table slowly shifted from formal business discussion into something warmer and more relaxed. Coffee was served, small porcelain cups placed neatly beside dessert plates, and the investors leaned back in their chairs with the satisfied expressions of people who had just discovered more value in a meeting than they originally expected. Outside the tall restaurant windows, the lights of Chicago shimmered across the dark surface of the river, reflecting like scattered gold beneath the night sky. Emily had almost forgotten how nervous she had felt earlier that evening. The conversation had moved naturally from logistics to broader ideas about technology and the future of global shipping. More than once, one of the investors asked her opinion directly, and each time she answered with the same calm honesty that had surprised them earlier. Finally, the silver-haired investor set his coffee cup down and looked toward Ethan with a thoughtful smile. Ethan, I think we can all agree this dinner has been far more productive than we expected. Ethan nodded slightly, though his attention flickered briefly toward Emily. That is good to hear. The man continued, folding his hands on the table. Our firm will move forward with the $40 million investment. Your expansion plan makes sense, and tonight's discussion confirmed that your team clearly understands the operational challenges ahead. For a moment, Emily thought she had misheard the number. $40 million. She quickly lowered her gaze toward her coffee cup, hoping no one would notice the surprise on her face. Ethan, however, simply extended his hand across the table with calm professionalism. I appreciate the confidence, he said. One of the other investors chuckled softly and gestured toward Emily again. You might want to thank her as well. Her forecasting idea alone probably saved your logistics model from several expensive delays. Emily felt another wave of warmth rise to her cheeks. I was only organizing the reports, she said quietly. The woman investor across from her smiled kindly. Sometimes the person organizing the reports understands the system better than the people presenting it. The table shared another moment of quiet laughter. A few minutes later, the meeting began to wrap up as the investors prepared to leave for their hotels. Handshakes were exchanged, business cards traded, and final details about the investment paperwork were briefly discussed. As the group slowly stood from the table, the silver-haired investor turned to Ethan one last time. You made an interesting choice tonight bringing Emily with you, he said thoughtfully. Ethan glanced toward her before answering. I trust her judgment. The investor nodded approvingly. That was obvious. After the investors left the dining area, the restaurant grew noticeably quieter. Emily remained standing beside the table for a moment, unsure whether she should say anything. Finally, she looked toward Ethan with a small, uncertain smile. Did everything go well? She asked. Ethan studied her for a second before letting out a quiet breath that sounded almost like a laugh. Emily, he said slowly, tonight went better than well. She tilted her head slightly, still unsure why he seemed so amused. Ethan reached for his coat before continuing. You just helped secure a $40 million partnership. Emily blinked in surprise. I did not mean to interrupt earlier, she said quickly. Ethan shook his head gently. You did not interrupt. His voice softened slightly as he added, you changed the entire meeting. And for the first time since the evening had begun, Emily realized that the quiet confidence she had shown at the table had done something far more powerful than she expected. It had changed the way Ethan Carter looked at her. When Ethan and Emily stepped out of the restaurant, the cool night air greeted them with the quiet hum of downtown Chicago settling into its late evening rhythm. Traffic moved steadily along the avenue, headlights reflecting across the glass towers that surrounded them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The evening had unfolded in a way neither of them had expected, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable, only thoughtful. The driver opened the car door, but Ethan raised a hand slightly, signaling him to wait. Instead, he turned toward Emily, studying her expression as she looked out across the glowing skyline. Are you tired? He asked gently. Emily shook her head with a small smile. No, I am just trying to understand how tonight actually happened. Ethan leaned lightly against the side of the car, the city lights reflecting faintly in his eyes. You handled yourself better than most executives I know, he said. Emily laughed softly at that. That is because I was not trying to impress anyone. I was just answering questions. Ethan nodded slowly. Exactly. Emily looked at him curiously. Is that unusual? Ethan thought for a moment before replying. In my world, yes. Most people in that room were trained to sell ideas. You were simply explaining them. The driver waited patiently while the conversation continued beside the car. For the first time that evening, Emily felt the pressure of the event fade completely. The quiet street felt more comfortable than the elegant dining room had earlier. I hope I did not create problems for you, she said after a moment. Ethan looked surprised. Problems? Emily nodded slightly. Some people at the office probably expected someone else to be sitting at that table tonight. Ethan knew exactly who she meant. Victoria Blake had attended similar dinners many times before, but tonight had been different in a way he could not ignore. They expected someone predictable, he said calmly. Instead, they met someone impressive. Emily lowered her eyes for a second, unsure how to respond to the compliment. The black sedan waited quietly beside them, its polished surface reflecting the streetlights. Finally, Ethan opened the car door for her with a polite gesture. "I will have the driver take you home," he said. Emily hesitated before stepping inside. "Thank you for inviting me tonight," she said sincerely. "I never imagined I would sit at a table like that." Ethan closed the door gently once she was seated, but instead of stepping away, he leaned slightly closer to the open window. "Emily," he said thoughtfully, "I do not think tonight was the last time you will sit at a table like that." The car began moving slowly through the city streets as Emily watched him grow smaller in the rear window. Her mind replayed the entire evening again, from the boutique transformation to the moment she spoke at the investor table. It felt almost unreal. Back at the restaurant entrance, Ethan remained standing on the sidewalk for another minute, watching the traffic pass. He had invited Emily to dinner because he trusted her work. But tonight he had discovered something else entirely. Beneath the quiet appearance everyone in the office overlooked was a woman whose intelligence and presence could command an entire room without even trying. And as he finally turned to walk toward his own waiting car, Ethan Carter realized something else he had not expected. The most surprising part of the evening had not been the investors, the deal, or even Emily's transformation. It was the simple fact that he suddenly wanted to see that confident version of her again. The next morning, Chicago woke under a pale gray sky, the kind that hinted at rain later in the afternoon. Inside the Carter Dynamics office building, the familiar rhythm of keyboards, phone calls, and quiet conversations had already begun. But there was something different in the air that day. News traveled quickly in offices, especially when it involved the chief executive officer. By 8:30, several employees were already whispering near the coffee machine about the previous evening's investor dinner. No one knew every detail yet, but everyone knew one thing. Ethan Carter had brought Emily Harper with him. When the elevator doors opened on the 22nd floor, Emily stepped out carrying the same simple shoulder bag she used every day. Her hair was tied back again, and her familiar glasses rested lightly on her nose. She had chosen her usual cardigan and modest office clothes, as if the elegant dinner from the night before had been nothing more than a passing dream. Still, as she walked across the office floor, she immediately felt the difference. Conversations softened when she passed. A few coworkers offered polite smiles that seemed more curious than friendly. One assistant near the printers leaned toward another and whispered something Emily could not quite hear. She kept her focus on her desk, determined to begin her morning work exactly the same way she always did. But the moment she sat down, someone appeared beside her desk. It was Daniel Foster, one of the senior analysts from the finance department. He rarely visited the administrative area, and the fact that he was standing there now made Emily glance up with mild surprise. "Good morning, Emily," Daniel said with a polite smile. "I heard you attended the investor dinner last night." Emily adjusted a stack of folders on her desk. "I did," she answered simply. Daniel nodded slowly. "And apparently it went very well." Emily hesitated before replying. "The meeting seemed successful." Daniel studied her for a moment, clearly curious but also respectful. "You must have impressed them," he said. "The entire finance team received a message early this morning that the partnership agreement is moving forward." Emily blinked in quiet surprise. Even though Ethan had mentioned the investment the night before, hearing it confirmed inside the office made the event feel more real. "That is good news for the company," she said calmly. Daniel smiled before walking back toward the finance department, but as he left he added one last comment over his shoulder. "For what it is worth, Emily, people are saying you helped make that happen." The words followed her long after he disappeared around the corner. A few minutes later, the glass door of Ethan Carter's office opened. He stepped out carrying a tablet and paused when he noticed Emily already at her desk organizing the morning schedule. For a moment, he simply watched her. The same quiet focus, the same calm expression. If anyone had walked into the office at that moment without knowing what had happened the night before, they would have seen nothing unusual. But Ethan knew better. He walked toward her desk slowly. Emily noticed him approaching and stood up politely. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said. Ethan stopped beside her desk and studied her with the faintest trace of amusement in his eyes. "Emily," he said thoughtfully, "after last night, I was not sure if you would still want to return to a normal workday." Emily smiled gently. "This is the work I know how to do." Ethan nodded once. though something in his expression suggested he was already thinking about something else. Something that might change far more than just one normal workday. The rest of the morning passed with the usual rhythm of office life. Yet something subtle had shifted around Emily Harper's desk. Emails continued to arrive, meetings were scheduled, reports were printed, and phones rang just as they did every other day. But now there were occasional glances in her direction that had not existed before. Some were curious, others were quietly impressed. Emily noticed them, but chose not to react. Instead, she focused on the same careful work that had always defined her role. By late morning, Ethan Carter called for a short leadership meeting in the conference room. Senior managers from finance, operations, and development gathered around the long table with their laptops open, ready to discuss the next phase of the expansion plan now that the investment had been confirmed. Emily entered the room quietly to distribute updated documents, intending to leave once the meeting began. She had done this many times before, but as she placed the final report in front of Ethan, he spoke before she could step away. "Emily, stay for a moment." The request made several executives glance up with mild surprise. Emily paused near the end of the table, unsure whether she had misunderstood. Ethan turned his tablet so the screen faced the group. "Last night our investors asked an important question about the hub rotation system," he said. The improvement idea came from Emily. A brief murmur moved around the room. Daniel Foster, who had spoken with her earlier that morning, nodded knowingly. Another manager leaned forward with interest. Ethan continued calmly. "I want the operations team to review her forecasting model. If the numbers hold, we will implement the changes during the first phase of the expansion." Emily felt the attention of the entire room shift toward her. It was an unfamiliar feeling. For 2 years she had worked behind the scenes, organizing information for other people to present. Now those same people were waiting to hear her explain it directly. She hesitated only a second before stepping closer to the table. "The adjustment is actually simple," she said, her voice steady despite the unexpected spotlight. She walked through the concept again, explaining how shared forecasting data could reduce shipping delays and balance freight loads between distribution centers. As she spoke, several managers began taking notes. When she finished, the room remained quiet for a moment. Finally, the head of operations leaned back in his chair with an impressed smile. "Why did we not hear this idea sooner?" he asked. Emily gave a small, modest shrug. "I was organizing reports. It did not seem like my place to present it." A few people exchanged thoughtful looks at that answer. Ethan watched the interaction carefully. The executives who had once barely noticed Emily now listened to her with genuine respect. When the meeting ended and the managers began leaving the room, Ethan remained seated for a moment while Emily gathered the remaining papers. "You handled that well," he said quietly. Emily gave a small smile. "I only explained the same thing I said last night." Ethan stood and walked toward the window overlooking the city skyline. "That may be true," he replied thoughtfully. "But today you were not speaking to investors. You were speaking to the leadership of this company." Emily paused beside the conference table, unsure what he meant. Ethan turned back toward her with a calm but decisive expression, and they listened. The afternoon sunlight filtered softly through the tall windows of the Carter Dynamics office, casting long reflections across the polished floor as employees returned to their desks after the leadership meeting. The conversation from the conference room slowly spread throughout the building, carried in quiet voices between departments. By 3 o'clock, most of the staff had heard that Emily Harper had presented an operational strategy directly to the executive team. For many people in the office, the idea felt almost surprising. For 2 years, Emily had been known as the quiet secretary who organized calendars, arranged documents, and quietly solved scheduling conflicts before they became problems. Now the same people were beginning to realize they might never have fully understood who she was. Emily, however, continued her work exactly the same way she always had. She reviewed the afternoon meeting requests, answered a series of emails from the logistics department, and prepared updated documents for the expansion project. The familiar routine helped steady her thoughts after the unexpected attention earlier that day. At 4:15, her phone rang softly on her desk. The caller identification showed Ethan Carter's office line. Emily answered immediately. "Emily Harper speaking." Ethan's voice came through calm and direct. "Emily, could you come to my office for a moment?" "Of course," she replied. She stood, smoothed the front of her cardigan, and walked toward the glass door at the corner of the office floor. Inside, Ethan's office overlooked the Chicago skyline stretching across the horizon, the afternoon light now fading into early evening shadows. Ethan stood near the window when she entered, holding a thin folder in his hand. "You wanted to see me?" Emily asked politely. Ethan turned and gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Please sit." Emily did so, sensing that this conversation was different from their usual discussions about schedules or reports. Ethan placed the folder on the desk and opened it slowly. "I spent part of the afternoon reviewing your forecasting model," he said. Emily felt a small flicker of nervousness. Was there a problem with the numbers? Ethan shook his head once. "No, the numbers were accurate. More accurate than most of the reports we receive from our operations consultants." Emily blinked in quiet surprise. Ethan continued speaking calmly. "The executive team has decided to move forward with your system improvement proposal. Implementation will begin during the first phase of the expansion next quarter." Emily nodded slowly, still absorbing the information. "I am glad the idea was helpful," she said modestly. Ethan studied her for a moment before continuing. "There is something else." He closed the folder and leaned slightly against the edge of the desk. "Your work over the past 2 years has gone far beyond the responsibilities of an administrative role." Emily looked uncertain. "I was only trying to keep the reports organized." Ethan allowed a faint smile to appear. "You did far more than organize them." He slid a single document across the desk toward her. Emily looked down at the page. It was an internal company memo. At the top of the document was a new title, Operations Strategy Analyst. Beneath it was her name. Emily looked up slowly. "Mr. Carter, I do not think this is meant for me." Ethan met her eyes with calm certainty. "It is." For a moment, Emily could not find the right words. The office outside remained busy with the normal sounds of keyboards and distant conversations, yet inside the quiet room something important had just changed. Ethan spoke gently. "You helped secure a $40 million partnership and improve the company's logistics model in a single evening." He paused before adding, "That is not the work of a secretary." Emily stared down at the document again, realizing that the opportunity in front of her was far bigger than she had ever imagined. And in that quiet office overlooking the city, the path of her career had just taken an entirely new direction. Emily remained seated for a long moment after Ethan finished speaking, her eyes resting on the document in front of her, as if the words might somehow rearrange themselves if she looked away. Operations Strategy Analyst. The title felt unfamiliar, almost unreal, yet the calm certainty in Ethan Carter's voice made it clear that the offer was genuine. Outside the office windows, the evening sun had begun to dip lower behind the Chicago skyline, painting the glass towers with a warm amber glow. Emily finally lifted her gaze from the paper and looked toward Ethan. "I do not know what to say," she admitted softly. Ethan leaned lightly against the desk with his arms crossed, his expression relaxed in a way that rarely appeared during high-pressure meetings. "You could start by saying you will accept the position," he replied with a faint smile. Emily let out a quiet breath that sounded half like a laugh. "I just spent 2 years making sure everyone else's schedules ran smoothly. Now you are asking me to help shape the company's operations strategy." Ethan nodded once. "Because for 2 years you have already been doing exactly that. You just did it quietly." Emily looked down again at the document, tracing the printed letters of her name with her eyes. The opportunity represented more than a promotion. It represented a completely different future from the one she had expected when she first applied for a simple administrative job. After another thoughtful moment, she reached for the pen resting on Ethan's desk. "Then I suppose I should begin learning the new role as soon as possible," she said. Ethan watched her sign the acceptance line with steady handwriting. When she finished, he took the document and placed it neatly back into the folder. "There is one more thing," he said. Emily tilted her head slightly. "What is that?" Ethan glanced toward the city outside the window before answering. "Last night the investors believed they were meeting the quiet assistant who organized my schedule." He looked back at her with calm confidence. "Instead, they met someone who could influence the future of the company." Emily felt a familiar warmth rise to her cheeks again. "I was only sharing an idea." Ethan shook his head gently. "You were showing them who you really are." For a moment, neither of them spoke as the final sunlight faded across the skyline. The office outside had begun to quiet as employees finished their workday and prepared to leave for the evening. Emily finally stood from the chair, still holding the feeling of disbelief that the past 24 hours had brought. "Thank you for believing in me," she said sincerely. Ethan walked with her toward the office door, his voice thoughtful but certain. "Emily, I did not believe in you because of last night." She paused and looked at him curiously. Ethan opened the door and gestured toward the office floor where the lights of the building reflected across rows of desks and computer screens. "I believed in you because you were already doing the work before anyone thought to notice." Emily smiled quietly at that and stepped back onto the office floor, the folder of new responsibilities waiting on her desk. As she walked across the room, several coworkers glanced up again with curiosity, but this time the whispers carried a different tone. They were no longer wondering who the quiet secretary was. They were beginning to realize she had been something much more all along. And as the lights of the Chicago skyline flickered to life outside the windows, Emily Harper understood that the evening that began with uncertainty had quietly transformed her life into something far greater than she had ever expected.